Okay, now you'll recall, from last week that in 1534, the Church of England broke from the authority of the Roman Catholic Church in the wake of King Henry VIII being excommunicated by the Pope for marrying Anne Boleyn and having his prior marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled. So this is a tumultuous time, right? This is when within the Catholic Church, their reformers are arising. So you have Luther in Germany, and so there is this division that is occurring. And so in 1534, the Church of England comes out from the formal authority of the Catholic Church. And they say, listen, the church in England is going to be, the head of that church is going to be the English monarch. It is not going to be the Pope. Okay, so you're having this division. So that's the English Reformation with the Church of England. But you have that division in the wake of that excommunication by the Pope of King Henry VIII. But despite that formal separation in 1534 of the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church, Henry never permitted the renunciation of Catholic doctrine or ceremony. There was a formal separation of authority, but he didn't permit the renunciation of that. It was during the 5-year period. I'm just catching us up here on where I was. During this time, you had this, in this 5-year period of Henry's reign, right after England's assertion of its independence from the Roman Catholic Church in 1534, you then have this 5-year period where 4 complete Bibles were published in modern English. You see the Coverdale Bible, the Matthews Bible, Taverner Bible, and the Great Bible. And then when Henry died in 1547, he was succeeded by King Edward VI, who was his 9-year-old son from his third wife, Jane Seymour. And it was during Edward's short reign that Protestant reforms in England were actually implemented. And as I said last week, the architect of those reforms, the man behind the curtain for the young King Edward, was Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And upon Edward's death, Mary, and that was in July 1553, Mary, who's the daughter of King Henry and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, she ascends to the throne, and she fervently embraced the Catholicism of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and she instituted anti-Protestant reforms and intensely persecuted the Protestants, putting many of them to death. And then during her reign, as you can imagine, you had many of England's greatest theologians and scholars going to Europe, especially Switzerland and Germany, where one could there be more safely identified with the Reformation. It wasn't as dangerous to be identified with the Reformation. And then right when we ended, I mentioned that William Whittingham, prepared while in Geneva, this Geneva New Testament, and there he made use of those verse divisions that had been put in by Robert Stephanus in the 1551 edition of his Greek text. So brother was just asking me before, what's that about? And I think it was simply to allow ease of citation, so that you would have verse divisions in these long chapters so when we say, Romans 14:5 or something, we know we can get to the specific thing. But he was asking, was there any hubbub about that? Did Intradin? I don't know that. I don't know if there was any, if that created any issues. But you had in the Greek text printed, you had the verse divisions, and so Whittingham puts those in his translation. All right, that's where we ended. Now, Queen Mary died in November of 1558, and she was then succeeded to who succeeds her to the throne is Queen Elizabeth I, who's the daughter of King Henry and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Now, she is a supporter of the Reformation, right? Mary, whose mother Catherine of Aragon had gotten bounced, her marriage was annulled, she fervently embraced the Catholicism of her mother. Well, now we have Elizabeth coming, who was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, so she's pro-Protestant. She's pro-Reformation. So when she comes to the throne, you have many of the people who are in England who are in Europe, who fled England when Mary became the monarch, the queen, because they were afraid she was going to persecute them as she did. So once we have Elizabeth coming to the throne, who's pro-Reformation, well, they then returned to England. But you had some of them stay behind because they were working on a translation of the Bible. And so they stayed for a couple more years, and the complete Geneva Bible was printed on April 10, 1560. So she had come to the throne in 1558. Many people come back at that time. You had people stay there in Geneva because there was this translation underway. That translation gets printed in 1560, and it was one of the finest English translations ever made. And many editions of the Geneva Bible were printed in the following decades, and the Geneva Bible achieved dominant popularity. So it's printed in 1560, and between 1570 and 1620, that 50-year period, the Geneva Bible was dominant. It was the most popular Bible out there, and it greatly influenced the King James Version, the King James Bible, which is also referred to as the Authorized Version. So it greatly influenced that. And here's the title page. In case you can't read that right there, here's the title page from the Geneva Bible. It says, "The Bible and Holy Scriptures contained in the Old and New Testament, translated according to the Hebrew and Greek, and conferred with the best translations in diverse languages, with most profitable annotations upon all the hard places, and other things of great importance as may appear in the epistle to the reader." Okay, so they're looking at the Hebrew and Greek. They're translating from the original languages, but they're also, as you would imagine, they are conferring with what they judge to be the best translations in all these different languages to help them in their translation. But they're also putting notes in. You see, so they're putting notes in to kind of guide people into a particular reading of something. And so that was part of what was going on there. Now, the notes in the Geneva Bible, they were influenced by Calvinist theology. Okay, that influence appears in relatively few of the notes, but it was there. So when they're having notes, they're trying to take the reader and help him see the text through the lens of Calvinism. And that didn't sit well with many people. Now, the popular name for this Bible, the Geneva Bible, it was known as the Britches Bible. And it was called the Britches Bible because in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, it says that Adam and Eve sewed fig leaves together and made themselves breeches. So it became known as the Britches Bible. Now, the clergy of the Church of England, they were not satisfied with the Geneva Bible, primarily because of the Calvinistic slant in some of its notes. And they considered Coverdale's Bible and the Great Bible to be inferior because those translations were not translated from the original languages, if you remember. So they don't like the Geneva Bible, which is translated from the original languages because of the annotations that have a Calvinistic slant. And they don't like the Coverdale Bible and the Great Bible because they weren't translated from the original languages. So in 1563, a massive translation project was launched under the direction of a man named Matthew Parker, who at that time was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the result was the publication in 1568 of the Bishop's Bible, which was a revision and an improvement on the Great Bible. So that's what this was. And though it was superior to the Great Bible, it definitely was an improvement of the Great Bible, it lacked the quality and the simplicity of the Geneva Bible. And though the church was endorsing the bishop's Bible and was pushing the use of this particular translation, and though there were many editions of the bishop's Bible published between 1568 and 1602, it never gained the popularity that its proponents had hoped for. The primary influence of this translation, the bishop's Bible, is that it served as the default version, the standard, for the translators of the King James Version. That's where its major influence came in. So they were looking at that basically as the background translation that they were working off of. Now, following Elizabeth's ascension to the throne in 1558, when she comes to the throne, right, she's pro-Protestant. So when she comes to the throne, there were many Catholics who fled to the European continent because they figured after Mary had killed almost 300 Protestants and all this, it's not going to be good to be a Catholic in England. So they fled in the fear of persecution. And with so many Protestant-oriented Bibles, English Bibles being published, the Catholics felt the need for an English translation that was friendlier, that had their wording, that was friendlier to their perspectives, and that included notes that explained Catholic doctrine. So they wanted a Bible that was friendlier translation for their perspective, but also that had notes like in the Geneva Bible, we've got notes with a Calvinistic slant. They wanted notes that would help somebody see their perspective on different texts. And such a translation was prepared by a Roman Catholic scholar named Gregory Martin, and he worked with several others. And the New Testament was prepared from 1578 to 1582. And they based their translation on the Vulgate, the Latin version, which was the official Latin version of the Roman Catholic Church. But they were also well aware of Hebrew and Greek in preparing this New Testament, and they drew from the Geneva Bible and also from the Coverdale Bible. Now, the first English translation of the Roman Catholic New Testament, this is done in 1582. It's printed in Reims, France, and it was opposed by English Protestants. And it had to be smuggled into the country because it was a Catholic perspective here. And then the Old Testament, so that's in 1582, you get a Roman Catholic New Testament known as the Reims New Testament. And then the Old Testament was not printed until 1610 in Douai, France. So both of these are done in France. And there you have the Catholic translation in 1610 is known as the Douay-Rheims Bible. Now here is and that, by the way, that Reims translation of the New Testament, the one that was printed in 1582, it did have some influence on the King James Version, and it was reprinted a number of times. And then the Old and New Testaments together, the Douay-Rheims version, that was completely revised in the middle of the 18th century, around 1750s. It was revised by a guy named Richard Challoner. Let me give you here the Bibles, complete Bibles in modern English before the King James Version. And I have inserted here the Kings and Queens of England, so you can see how things fit, right? So we have under Henry VIII, in 1534, you have this formal separation of the Church of England from the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Then we have that 5-year period where we get 4 complete Bibles in English. Then we have King Edward, short reign. We have Queen Mary, relatively short reign, and no Bibles printed then. And then we have Elizabeth, who comes to the throne in 1558, and we have the Geneva Bible in 1560 and the Bishop's Bible in 1568. Then King James comes to the throne in 1603. And though he has nothing to do with it, you have the Douay-Rheims Bible, the Roman Catholic Bible, completed in France in 1610. So that's the rundown. We've got 7 complete translations in modern English before the King James Version. Now, Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603, having ruled England for 44 years, and she's succeeded by James VI, King of Scotland, who ascends to the throne, the English throne. He ascends as King James I of England. Okay, so here he is. He looks like a dandy there, doesn't he? But he comes in 1603, and then in 1604, the next year, he agreed to a request by a man named James Reynolds. Sometimes it's written Reynolds. But by this man, James Reynolds, who was a well-respected, a distinguished Puritan, he agrees to a request by this person for making a new English translation of the Bible. Now, Reynolds, being a Puritan, he may have been hoping that James would simply authorize the Puritan-friendly, Calvinistic Geneva Bible rather than tackle a new translation project. But James took the opportunity of that request to create an alternative to both the Geneva Bible and the Bishop's Bible. Okay, neither of which he thought was satisfactory, though he had a particular dislike for the Geneva Bible. So this falls in his lap. This guy comes and says, hey, do this. He may have been thinking, all right, I want him to authorize the Geneva Bible with Calvinistic slant to it. Well, he says, hey, man, we're going to have another one because I'm not happy with the Geneva Bible or the Bishop's Bible. So he authorized. Now, he chose 54 of England's finest scholars. You see, you have to be a scholar to be able to do this work. He chose 54 of England's finest scholars from Westminster, Oxford, and Cambridge to prepare that translation. And the work on the translation began in 1607, and it was completed in 1611. That's when the King James Bible, or the King James Version, was printed. And the translators, as I mentioned, they used the Bishop's Bible as a guideline, and working from the Hebrew and Greek. Okay, this is a translation from the original languages, but they've got the Bishop's Bible back here, kind of as a check and to look at. But they also took into account Tyndale's translation, the Matthew's Bible, Coverdale Bible, the Great Bible, and the Geneva Bible. And as I say, of course you would. If you have any work by people who are skilled in translating, and you're going to be translating, well, you'd be crazy not to look at it. Right? Because they may have insight or something. You may see something, you say, well, I wonder why they thought this. And then you run that down, right, to see if there's merit to how they saw it. So that's what they were doing. Now, marginal notes were omitted. You remember in the Geneva Bible, they had these notes trying to steer people to help them see, the Calvinistic view. But in the King James, the marginal notes were omitted, except for notes that were lexical. Okay, notes that were relate to the explanation of Hebrew or Greek words. So they had some notes in there, but they weren't really these theological or doctrinal notes. Now, the first edition is published in 1611, and here's a close-up of that, and you can see the title page is printed with the words, appointed to be read in the churches. And I don't know if you can see that there, but it says appointed to be read in the churches right there. Now, despite becoming known as the authorized version, there is no record of official church or royal authorization for the version. But how it came to be known as the Authorized Version, no doubt, is because the official sanction and approval of the translation was assumed, right, from the fact that the one who initiated it was King James, and it was printed by the king's own printer, that fellow named Robert Barker. So that's how it came to be assumed, even though there was no formal declaration or authorization. It became known that way. Now, this version immediately displaced the bishop's Bible, and within a decade or two, it became more popular than even the Geneva Bible, which was wildly popular. So there's something going on, but this is a really excellent translation. It became more popular than the Geneva Bible. This was the Bible. I'm going to talk to you about some, there were revisions and all that. But the King James Version, speaking generally, the King James Version was the Bible of the English-speaking world for about 350 years. Okay? John has a story. Somebody told him, he said, you'd be studying with somebody, I'll go home and I'll be showing somebody something. They'll be like looking out of a different translation, New International Version, something like that. And his family would be going, yeah, that's what that book says, but what's the Bible say? And go over to the King James, right? So it was, this was the translation. And though it was heavily indebted to earlier English translations, it has justifiably, the King James translation has justifiably been called the noblest monument of English prose. These guys did a great job in translating this. And there were various corrections, changes. You don't hear this much, but there were various corrections, changes, and revisions of the King James Version in the ensuing decades and centuries. Hundreds of changes were made in the 1613 edition, and a 1616 edition, it corrected many printing errors. However, these corrections were ignored in some future printings. A 1629 revision was done by two of the original translators, two of those who were among the 54 scholars who had been involved in the 1611 edition. Well, there was a revision that was done by them, Samuel Ward and John Boyes. And then 9 years later, in 1638, there was a further revision by Ward and Boyes, who were joined by Thomas Goad and Joseph Mead. And that version was printed. And this 1638 edition, that then became the standard edition. From 1638, it was the standard edition until 1762. Okay, so that had a long run as the Duke, right? And then printing errors continued to crop up, though. And some of these printing errors in the King James Version are infamous. In 1631, there was the Wicked Bible, where Exodus 20:14 says, "Thou shalt commit adultery." And you had the Forgotten Sins Bible in 1638. Luke 7:47 says, "Her sins, which are many, are forgotten instead of forgiven." 1641, the More See Bible. Revelation 21:1 says, "There was more see," instead of "no more see." And then the Unrighteous Bible in 1653, 1 Corinthians 6:9 says, "Know ye not that the unrighteous shall inherit the kingdom of God?" So that was quite a printing error there. Now the King James Version, it was revised in 1762 by Dr. F.S. Paris, and he attempted basically to update and correct spelling and grammar and punctuation, to correct printing errors, and also to correct and make it more uniform in how italics were used. And he also made a few changes to the text, corrections kind of thing, differences. And Benjamin Blaney, he expanded on Paris's work in 1769, and he published an edition of the King James Bible that became the standard version for 100 years. Okay, so that Blaney's version or edition of the King James Version became the standard one for a long time. But printing errors continued to crop up. And you had in 1801 the Murderer's Bible, where it says in Jude 16, these are murderers instead of murmurers. Okay, complainers walking after their own lust. In 1806, the Standing Fishes Bible, where Ezekiel 47:10 says, and it shall come to pass that the fishes, instead of fishers, meaning fishermen, that the fishes shall stand upon it. And then Wife Hater's Bible in 1810, where Luke 14:26 says, if any man come to me and not hate his father, his mother, wife, and children, brother, and sister, yeah, even his own wife, instead of life, okay, he also cannot be my disciple. 1873 revision of the King James Version by F.H.A. Scrivener. It's known as the Cambridge Paragraph Bible. And this was the first time modern paragraphs were introduced into the Bible. And again, that raises the question, was there a stink about that? And I don't know. I don't know if somebody putting paragraphs or numbers, if that was considered changing it or just helping reading, if that was, I haven't seen that, but I actually haven't bored down and looked into that. But anyway, this was the first time you got paragraphs. So that's in Scrivener's edition, it's considered the most accurate of all of the King James versions, and a revision of the Cambridge Paragraph Bible that was printed in 1994. Now, as we get into the latter part of the 19th century, it becomes clear to many people that changes in language, in spelling, the advancement of scholarship, including greater insight into the original Greek text. We have discovered many, many Greek manuscripts, which helps us in assessing what did the original inspired writer write. So in light of those kinds of things, it was seen that, look, we need a new Bible translation. And a committee of scholars was appointed in England to undertake that task. And what was originally going to be simply a revision of the King James Version, it became in fact a new translation. And it was published in 1885 as the Revised Version, also known as the English Revised Version. And that was the first English Bible to exclude the Apocrypha. You remember Coverdale? That he was the first guy, he pulled out the apocryphal books and placed them between the Old and New Testament, and that's how the Bibles were printed since then. Well, here in 1885, with the Revised Version, this is the first time that the apocryphal, those books are not even there. Okay, they're printed in a separate volume if you wanted to get that, but those books aren't even there. And then the preferred wording of American scholars, who were participating in this new translation that came out as the Revised Version, the preferred wording of the American scholars that had been rejected by the committees. So they had lost. They'd been saying, no, this is a better rendering. You ought to say this here. This catches it better. And they said, no, we disagree with you. This is the right way to go. So those renderings that had been rejected, they were represented in the translation that was published in 1901. And they had to wait that long because there was some kind of commitment saying that you won't publish this for so many years. Okay, so you have this, the Revised Version in 1885, and then in 1901, based on the American take on certain words and phrases, how they want to do it, things that had been rejected, that comes out in 1901 as the American Standard Version. So those are really the first English translations you get. Obviously, you're getting revisions of the King James, tweaking of the King James. But now you have the first new translations since the King James. And there has been a flood of English translations since the American Standard Version in 1901, particularly in the last 60 or 70 years. Let me just mention some of the generally respected. I mean, there's all kinds of translations. But let me give you some of the generally respected translations that were done by various committees of scholars. Now, there are differences among the translations in translation philosophy. In other words, how closely do I want to stick to the words and the order? How free do I want to make it? You see, there are differences in translation philosophy, and sometimes there's differences in the underlying text. You see, what they take to be the original text critical issues. So differences in philosophy, sometimes differences in the underlying text. But all of these that I'm going to mention to you, these are serious academic efforts. And of course, no translation of Scripture is above criticism because all of it is work done by limited human beings, right? So no translation is perfect. No translation is inspired in that sense, right? To the extent it captures what was said in the inspired, then yes, right? But you can see there's room for criticizing and changing, and that's why you keep seeing revisions, because people keep getting convinced that, no, I think this can be said better, this can be refined, this can be stated more accurately in line with what was said in Scripture. So, now the Revised Standard Version, okay, so in 1885, you have the Revised Version or English Revised Version, 1901, the American Standard Version. And then in 1952, the Revised Standard Version. It's a revision of the 1901 American Standard Version, and that was done by a committee of American scholars. Originally started out with 13, and then it was increased to 32. And the New Testament appeared in 1946. The Old Testament followed in 1952. And the New Testament, I didn't mark this on here, but the New Testament was revised in 1971. And then we get in 1989, the New Revised Standard Version, which was a committee revision of the Revised Standard Version. As I say, it was published in 1989. And then the new Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. All right? That was printed in 2022, just last year. Okay, and like I say, people wonder, they say, well, why do you keep doing this? Well, they keep doing it, like I say, because, if you discover more papyri or more ancient writings that shed greater light on a particular word, like maybe you'll discover that, hey, this Greek word, it seems to us now from the examples of writings at the time that this word had a greater range than we knew. Because here we see in this letter, this guy's writing to his wife, he's using this word in a certain way that we hadn't seen before. Okay, so now that gives you more insight. So then you go back and say, well, maybe that nuance of the word is what's intended here. And then committees discuss and think context and all this stuff. Okay, so you see, so you're always open to revision. You're always open to somebody saying, I think you missed this, this could be done better. Now, the Jerusalem Bible, that's a translation by Roman Catholic scholars that appeared in 1966. The first part came out in 1956. Now, that name, Jerusalem Bible, that name is derived from its relationship, this translation's relationship to the French Bible, a French version known as La Bible de Jerusalem. That's why you say that's why it's called the Jerusalem Bible. It's because of its connection to that French translation. And that French translation heavily influenced that translation, the Jerusalem Bible. The New Jerusalem Bible, which was a revision of the 1966 Jerusalem Bible, that was published in 1984, and then the Revised New Jerusalem Bible was published in 2019. Now, as a footnote, it occurs to me, I probably ought to mention, there's also probably in these revisions, there is a financial incentive. Okay, right? Because if I sit here and I think the scholars working on it are trying to improve it, but publishers and all say, hey, if I can get now, here's a new revision, okay, we'll buy that too. Okay, so I think that's probably a factor that comes in there. Now, the New American Bible is a translation, another translation by Roman Catholic scholars, published in 1970. And the most recent edition of that, the New American Bible, is called the New American Bible Revised Edition. That was published in 2011. Now, the New English Bible, that's a translation by British scholars which claim that it had no restriction by prior translations. In other words, they were trying to declare that we are going to be freer than most from the influence of prior translations. Some influence is inescapable, right? Because you're translating the same text and the same people have been looking at it, right? But that was what they're saying. And the New Testament appeared in 1961, the Old Testament in 1970. And it's a rather free rendering of the original languages. The Revised English Bible, which is a revision of the 1970 New English Bible, that was published in 1989. So you've got the New English Bible and you have the Revised English Bible. Then the New American Standard Bible, which is a revision of the American Standard Version. This was done by evangelical scholars. And the New Testament appeared in 1963, the Old Testament in 1971. And it's an accurate translation that's clear and readable, but it's not as smooth as some others. You see, and that's generally the trade-off you get. And that's where the philosophy of translation comes in, is how woodenly do you want to stick to things? Because when you get too wooden, nobody wants to read it. Right? So you always have to have some, in bringing something into another target language, you have to have some degree of smoothness and readability. So it's a little bit more stilted than some. It was revised in 1995, was called the New American Standard Updated Edition. And that revision was updated most recently in 2020, which is called the New American Standard 2020. Now, the New International Version, all right, that's a translation by interdenominational team of scholars. The New Testament's out in 73. The Old Testament was out in 1978. And this was instrumental in my conversion. This translation, because I picked it up and John pushed it on me and I could actually read it. As opposed to King James English, which was very old at the time, hundreds of years old, which was hard to read. I could make sense out of this. And so it was instrumental in my conversion. So I have a soft spot in my heart for it. But it's a freer translation. It's still a scholarly, good translation, but it's freer than the New American Standard Bible, and one that it more accurately reflects contemporary English. And that's partly why the New International Version became the most popular selling Bible in the English language. You see, because they hit that right balance between accuracy and readability. Now, there were some complaints, rightfully, about its accuracy in 78, and it was revised in 1984, and it's improved all the time. Then the revision in 2005, they revised it, but they gave it a new name called Today's New International Version, the TNIV, in 2005. But with the revision in 2011, there were complaints about TNIV. But the most current revision of the NIV in 2011, when they did that revision, they scrapped the 1984 and the 2005 TN. In other words, they quit publishing it. So now you have the 2011 NIV, and it's a good translation. It's readable. But if you're studying something, you need to look at a lot of translations, in my judgment. Okay? Because that tend to be helpful. Now, the New King James Version was an attempt to bring some of the archaic language of the King James Version up to date. and it's a scholarly translation, but it's one that is imposed on a King James Version base. The New Testament came out in 1979. The Old Testament came out in 1982. The English Standard Version, which is the version that I have used for many years now, the English Standard Version is the work of a large team of evangelical scholars. It was published in 2001. They describe it as, quote, essentially literal, end quote, meaning the translators sought as much as possible to capture the precise wording of the original text, the personal style of each Bible writer. It's not as smooth. Like I said, there's always this trade-off. So it's not as smooth as something like the New International Version. But as I say, it's the main translation that I use, and it was revised in 2007, revised in 2011, revised in 2016. Now, the New English Translation, that's the English Standard. The New English Translation is a translation of more than 25 scholars that was made available for free on the internet in 2001. That was the idea. We're going to have this where people can see it, use it. So they put it out on the internet in 2001, and there were revisions in 2003 and 2005, and there was a major update in 2019. Now, this translation includes almost 61,000 translators' notes. Okay? So you can go, like there'll be many times, it said they'll explain what's going on here. Why you're sitting here going, what? Why? They said they'll explain it. And sometimes just very helpful. Okay, so it's almost 61,000 translators' notes that you ought to be aware of. Now then we have the Holman, in 2004, the Holman Christian Standard Bible. That's the work of a large international, interdenominational team, scholars, that was published 2004. The New Testament came out in 1999. It was revised in 2010, and it was revised again in 2016. And with the 2016 revision, the name was changed from the Holman, which is a publisher, from the Holman Christian Standard Bible to simply the Christian Standard Bible. But it is a different translation than the Holman, a revision. Okay? Now, popular paraphrases. Now, a paraphrase is where someone expresses in their own words what he thinks. Let me say this. What he thinks is being said in the text, okay? It can be helpful, but it is more commentary and interpretation than translation. And for that reason, paraphrases should not be confused with Scripture, right? They are not translations. They are paraphrases where someone is putting in their own words. And that can be helpful. That's fine. But it's not what was written by God. So I just want to be cautious about that and say, so that I say, thus saith the Lord, when I'm saying, no, thus saith Eugene Peterson. You see, and as bright as he may be. But here are some of the popular paraphrases: Living Bible, Good News, Contemporary English, The Message, and the New Living Translation. And I'm over time. Next week, come back. You'll enjoy it. Dave Verrett is teaching the class. Thank you, brother.